A massive shout out to Lejar Forlag in Oslo, to Studio Ansage, who have been hosting us here in Berlin, to everyone out in the struggle for resistance against repression. And we would also like to invite you to take some deep breaths and to think with us as we enter straight back into chapter 3 of the book Ricochet, Cultural Epigenetics and the Philosophy of Change by myself, Alex Head. And that can also be purchased from the Bandcamp page, and also is now distributed globally by Antenna Books. We are going to jump right back into a long chapter of the book, very exciting chapter with some new discoveries and some rediscoveries on page 64. I began this book with a chapter that suggests exploiting biological development such as mutation and epigenetic frequency as models with which to discuss cultural replication, history and power. Later on, I will develop my observations with explicit reference to a form of cultural work which is familiar to me as an artist working in the field of radio and podcasting. That chapter is called The Radio Mast and the Cultural Forager. To extend my claim that biological models are of value to studying and understanding processes of cultural evolution, it will be my task in the current chapter to expand those models further into the historical record, into a period of time very far away from my own experience indeed. Subsequent chapters will then explore the examples of organic development I have selected, brackets epigenetics and mutation, close brackets, with a view to developing further applications. In this chapter, I will apply what I've learned about mutation and epigenetics to one of the fundamental origin narratives of humankind, the Garden of Paradise. Timeline of the Cultural Garden of Paradise. Evidence of imagery depicting a holy tree of knowledge or tree of life extend way back to the 10th millennium and may have been in use for many years prior. When it comes to human histories and human thought, after a certain point in the archaeological record, it is simply one interpretation versus another, and the choice is typically one between different male perspectives. This is particularly the case concerning the period before the first recorded writing emerges, through which to decipher the crumbs of material evidence that have been found. As some archaeologists like to put it, the living beast escapes the fossilized footprint. But the question of precision is assumed to be a question of deep time, and not a question of gendered histories. History prior to the earliest written artifacts is obscured because of material decay, so the assumption goes, and not because the entire female experience of life is simply unaccounted for. To continue, the oldest known written documents are the ancient Egyptian pyramid texts, which date to circa 2400 to 2300 BCE. But prior to the time in which these texts were inscribed into the subterranean walls of ancient Egyptian pyramids, humans had been walking the earth in our more or less current form for over 2 million years. Footnote 2. Homo erectus, meaning upright man, is an extinct species of archaic human from the Pleistocene, with its earliest occurrence about 2 million years ago. Contemporaneity of Australopithecus, Paranthropus, and early Homo erectus in South Africa. Prior to the 2 million year mark, two competing groups dominated the Earth, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. And circa 30,000 years BCE, a number of artifacts entered the archaeological record, which suggests that, at this time, humans appreciated what we have labelled the spiritual world through a concept known as the Greek goddess. In and of itself, the figure on the opposite page would clearly make an unspeakable travesty of the inner world of all humanoids at this time, because those worlds are simply unknowable today. Depiction of illustration, page 67. So we have here a kind of mother goddess archetype made out of raku-fired clay. It's shot on a kind of curved and invisible grey background. It's a sculpture that I made in 22 in Želev in the Czech Republic with Helena and Jan, and also Katka and Nati and Hugo. We were there, raku firing several things over 2 days. And what you see here is a piece that's had white glaze thrown onto it and then rubbed off. And with the concomitant burn marks from the raku firing, you have a very solid, very present clay figure indeed. The great goddess hypothesis maintains that matrifocal or perhaps matriarchal societies were pervasive prior to the agricultural revolution circa 10,000 BCE. And sculptural objects do imply that women not only bore life, but were celebrated as sacred within the cultures of those who fashioned such objects. But who fashioned them? One cannot know. In his lecture, The Great Goddess Remembered, 2010, Professor and interdisciplinary consultant Dr. Grant L. Voth describes the well-known female figurines scattered across Europe and as far north as Siberia, which date from 30,000 to 5,000 BCE. Quote, "The existence of these female figurines and carvings has led a number of archaeologists and anthropologists and historians to assert that through most of the Paleolithic and into the Neolithic periods, the humans worshipped a powerful goddess. Perhaps the societies she presided over would have been matrifocal, brackets woman-centered, close brackets, maybe even matriarchal. If the hunting and gathering period of human history took place in the wilds of nature itself, then perhaps the adoration of a mystical plant or garden was yet to be culturally expressed. Which is another way of saying that life, death and rebirth, born from women in particular, would have held a great deal of symbolic and spiritual force. If, as a certain cliché goes, paradise can only be described from without, so the projection of a matrifocal society as a utopian era of equilibrium within the organic world would, chronologically speaking, begin afterwards. As the nostalgic ideal of a more sustainable life plays on our minds ever more, perhaps the worship of a garden of paradise overlapped with the worship of a great goddess. There is no reason why these two concepts, the great goddess and a mythical unitary Garden of Eden cannot have been held at the same time. Some archaeological evidence would suggest that veneration of a holy garden came to eclipse the goddess as the primary site of spiritual significance, as the mysteries of creation became more apparent in closed communities. If, on the other hand, the Garden of Paradise was matriarchal, then the period leading up to the domestication of plants and animals would have been it. In addition, the Great Garden of Eden has also been described as the conscious mind itself, while the wild forest beyond represents our unconscious and the unknown. Ricocheting forward some 15,000 years, archaeologists have suggested that early cave paintings that depict prey animals insinuate that fertility and rebirth played a central role in the belief systems of the time around 15,000 BCE and earlier. This is because successfully killing and consuming an animal, brackets or plant, close brackets, is inherently reliant on life cycles. Prior to the insights afforded by cultivating crops and learning animal husbandry, woman's reproductive ability could have been interpreted as uniquely godlike. It is women, after all, that bring life into this world. As the hypothesis goes, so too did women bring the universe into being. Footnote 3. At any rate, that's how it happened to me in the Whittington Hospital one bright morning back in the year of 1983. If I may be permitted to describe this period as, from a cultural perspective, pre-garden, there is nonetheless certainly no shortage of vegetation, fertility and mortal fear in the minds of those early Homo erecti searching through the earth for shelter and sustenance. The image of the mother goddess demonstrates a point of departure as the earliest period at which human belief, brackets rather than behaviour, close brackets, has been identified. When Dr. Voth replicates the theory that the Paleolithic imagination would have conceptualized the eternal, the cyclical, the self-renewing nature of the cosmos as female, as the great goddess. He does so as a man who, like myself, can never know what women feel or experience while he and I live, think, work, and retain the social status of men in patriarchal societies. This point is driven home by the evidence that although the magician, or quote, sorcerer in the cave, unquote, is overwhelmingly portrayed as masculine, brackets Zarathustra, Merlin, Gandalf, Steiner, Crowley, the list is long, close brackets. 3/4 of handprints in ancient cave art were left by women. At the bare minimum, the next period of cultural development that I need to explore in order to create a timeline of human belief in relationship to plants, holy trees or gardens of paradise, is the Neolithic age, which occurred in different places across the world between circa 12,000 and 4,500 BCE. Important characteristics of the period include advancements in technology, coupled to the domestication of animals, the development of farming, pottery, and therefore food storage. The social impact was huge. Beginning at different times across the globe, these advancements in human adaptation to our physical environment acted as catalysts to human cultural and philosophical life. The term Neolithic does not apply to every part of human development on Earth at that time, nor does it signify a linear progression. For example, some societies developed ceramics before farming, others developed writing, then farming, then ceramics, and so forth. Quote, "This long and gradual transition was not completed in Britain and Scandinavia until after 3000 BCE, and is known as the Mesolithic." Encyclopaedia Britannica, entry on Neolithic, 2020. For Dr. Voth, there are parallel developments between the mythology depicted in cave paintings prior to and the emergent temples and sites of worship after the Neolithic or agricultural revolution. For example, again in lecture 14, he says the following: "Once people settle down, the goddess's fertility role is shifted to the plants and animals that became the basis of village life. The soil itself, as we move to the agricultural revolution, becomes the body of the goddess, the womb that gives life. The great goddess becomes the great goddess of agriculture." It is from this kernel of truth that many scholars derive the explanation of one of, if not the largest bodies of mythology and religion, the dying and resurrected God. Born, as it were, from the concept of the goddess, this marks a significant shift in the religious paradigms familiar to me today. Here, a new character enters the frame altogether, namely, the male god. This transition is of course highly complex and geolocally contingent. Myths are not the same everywhere but offer us patterns, archetypal forms tied to human experiences which emerge within cultural expressions. But there are patterns, and my own review of the literature and dozens of well-referenced articles demonstrate a sufficient amount of overlap between narratives that highlight the powers of both male and female gods, before settling on male deities as the predominant embodiment of godly power on earth. There is an arc. Patriarchy is real, don't be a dick about it. Here is one example of that pattern, in which the technology of agriculture resurfaces within the worlds of the great goddess Inanna, an important mythological figure from the Fertile Crescent around 2500 BCE. Who will plough my vulva? Who will plough my high field? Who will plough my wet ground? Somewhat different, one might say, from the creation narrative of Judeo-Christianity some 2,500 years later. Clearly an enormous shift has occurred in the theological mechanics of the Garden of Paradise. How much of this timeline of the garden can be meaningfully mapped and compared this way? So far, the material evidence I have alluded to has been spread over such a broad range of time, brackets between 30,000 and the year 1, or the beginning of the Common Era, close brackets, as to ensure that any projection on my behalf would be excessively theoretical. However, I have established that the way in which creationist powers have been vested in either female or male identified gods has undergone a fundamental transition. There is not enough ground staked out between these articulations of possible pre-garden matriarchies, fertility goddesses, and the Bible, but a continuity between a series of cultural gardens of creation is apparent. To explore in this way requires concentration. In order to tie these cultural expressions to organic processes of evolution, through mutation or epigenetically triggered patterns within an organism, I am going to need further articulations of gardens of paradise. When these additional patterns or articulations have been established, it should be noted that my assessment, indeed my comparison between A and B, will still be a projection. The mode of transport clearly affects the journey, and I am anticipating travelling across large areas of space and time. The value of doing this, however, will become apparent once it has been made explicit that specific rules and insights are to be gleaned from the overall process. As the Neolithic age swings into action and ritual worship increases alongside farming and the cultivation of new tools, crops and ideas, fertility too begins to be expressed with a different emphasis. As I have noted above in the entreaty from the great goddess Inanna, it is possible to correlate these agricultural shifts with cultural ones in places, providing one accounts for the predominantly masculine voice of history. The spiritual dimension of Neolithic life brings a great deal more architectural detail. This leads to new dimensions in my timeline of the garden, or timeline of the Garden of Paradise. For example, early ceramics from the 4th millennium BCE contain imagery of a palm tree motif that will become highly significant in the adoration of temples and sacred sites of burial in the coming millennia. As the term Neolithic neither captures the full spectrum of peoples nor the variety of land masses involved in agriculture, pottery and collective living at that time, brackets circa 10,000 to 4,500 BCE, and since it covers such a huge swathe of human history, the pursuit of a particular pattern of cultural reference sometimes feels like a naive and impossible pursuit. All that remains are fragments of human life, fragments of cultural expression and belief. Eventually, I want to bring this discussion into the age in which I actually live. So here goes. The survival of written documentation begins around circa 3,300 BCE. From the surviving records presented in this chapter and additional artifacts from the preceding millennia, Dr. Voth and others observe that the dependency that entire communities and empires came to place on seasonal farming morphologically altered the religious topography of those passing on their beliefs during this time. They therefore assert that the birth of the dying god during what is known as the Neolithic era, brackets, but also outside of its geographic range, close brackets, must surely be tied up with patterns of fertile crops and fallow lands. As hypotheses concerning the thoughts of persons thousands of years ago go, I find this to be reasonable. Material life changes our internal realities. If the exposure of humans to animal husbandry and the role of seeds among fertile land catalyzed new spiritual and religious emphases, these ideas can certainly be found in the figures that came to dominate Egyptian theology, and the royal bloodline of the period. For example, the theological figures of the goddess Isis and the god Osiris. Description of the illustration on page 72. A simple form illustration of a piece of ceramic from the 3rd millennium Babylonia demonstrates a simple leafy system on the side of a vase, itself drawn onto a fragment of ceramic. After the date palm and sacred trees, H. Danthine, 1937. In the myth of Isis and Osiris, it is tempting to posit a great many hypotheses to the question of how religious life changed, certainly in the Fertile Crescent around 3200 BCE. At the beginning of the Egyptian royal line.